Hello and welcome to another video in my Global History and Geography Regents Preparation Series. I'm Justin Cellini, and in this video, we're going to continue examining the Part 2 section of the exam. This video will continue our discussion of inferring information from primary sources in order to answer short answer questions. If you're new here, I highly recommend going back and reviewing my videos that cover sourcing documents in terms of context, point of view, and purpose. In this video, we'll focus specifically on analyzing how audience can affect the message of an author, and discuss how to answer questions about audience on this part of the Regents exam. So what is an audience? An audience is the person or group of people an author is speaking to or writing to. For example, while all viewers of YouTube could potentially be my audience for this video if they click on the thumbnail for it, my intended audience is far more narrow. You can probably infer my intended audience based on the content of my videos, which can serve as your evidence. Since I am discussing strategies for being successful on the Global History Regents exam, you could infer that my intended audience is 10th grade high school students who live in New York State. Audience can also have an effect on the content of a video, of a speech, or a piece of writing. Consider the example we just talked about. Since my audience is high school students who live in New York, my videos don't discuss how to be successful on social studies exams given in New Jersey, or any other state for that matter. And since the videos are intended for an audience of teenagers, I generally try to keep them to 15 minutes or less, so that I don't risk losing the attention of my viewers. Let's discuss an example that I'm going to make up for the sake of illustrating the impact of audience more clearly. Imagine a scenario in which you were invited to Yankee Stadium to give a lecture on the greatest baseball teams of all time. Who would be in your audience? I would assume that it would mostly be Yankees fans, since you would be at Yankee Stadium. So now ask yourself, how might an audience of Yankees fans affect the lecture you give about the greatest baseball teams of all time? Most likely, you'd be mentioning the 1961 and 1998 Yankees teams, and not the 1986 Mets, and certainly not the 2004 or 2007 Red Sox. If you did mention those other teams, you'd be booed right off the field, and that's probably something you'd like to avoid. As the speaker, you probably want to tell your audience what they want to hear, or at least avoid making them too upset. Let's take a look at an example from a previously administered Regents exam and discuss how to properly answer a question about how audience affects an author's message. This particular example is from the January 2020 Regents exam. Check out the link in the description below to view the complete test, as well as its corresponding answer key. I would recommend using the following method for effectively answering questions that ask you to analyze the impact of audience on an author's message. Step 1. Try to determine who wrote the document, when it was written, and where it was written. This is important because if you can activate your prior knowledge about the author, place, or time, it may already give you hints about what the author may discuss in the document. Before reading the actual document, annotate the document by writing down any related information that you can recall. Next, read the question being asked. In this case, the question is asking for you to explain how the audience affects what Mikhail Gorbachev includes in his speech. Now, read the document introduction and the document itself and try to determine the intended audience of the author. Finally, once you have determined the author's audience, try to find something in the document that the intended audience may be interested in hearing or seeing. Let's go through the process together. If you look at the top of the document, you'll see that this document is an excerpt from a speech given by Mikhail Gorbachev on December 25, 1991, and that the speech was broadcast on television in the Soviet Union and printed in a Soviet newspaper. So before we read the document, we should brainstorm and write down anything we might recall about Mikhail Gorbachev and this time period in Russian history. You might recall from your studies that Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader that brought significant social, political, and economic reform to the Soviet Union through policies such as glasnost, perestroika, and democratization. You might also recall that late 1991 was when the Soviet Union officially collapsed, signaling the end of the Cold War. Many historians cite Gorbachev's policies as the reasons for the fall of the Soviet Union. Perhaps some people living in the Soviet Union were upset with Gorbachev's policies, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Now, let's see if we can determine Gorbachev's intended audience. In this case, we see that Gorbachev's speech was broadcast on Russian television and published in a Russian newspaper. Gorbachev also refers to his compatriots and fellow citizens in the beginning of the excerpt. Based on this evidence, I can infer that Gorbachev's intended audience was all the citizens of the Soviet Union. So now that we know the author's intended audience, we have to find something in the document that someone in the Soviet Union might be interested in hearing. Pause the video here and read the document for yourself while keeping this question in the back of your mind. What might a very large group of potentially angry Russians be interested in hearing from their leader on the eve of their empire's collapse? After reading the document, unpause the video and I will show you what I think the Russians might be interested in hearing about. Let's take a look at what jumped out at me when I read this document as pieces of information that might appeal to the Russian people. Early in the speech, Gorbachev mentions that he would be stepping down as president of the Soviet Union. You would think that there would be some negativity associated with a president resigning, but Gorbachev doesn't focus on the negative. Instead, he draws attention to the positive changes that have taken place since 1985, which may make potentially angry Russian people feel better about their current predicament. For example, he mentions that totalitarianism has been eliminated, and new social, political, and economic freedoms have become a reality. If the question associated with this document was asking about Gorbachev's purpose, to me, this reads like he's trying to convince his people that his presidency was not a failure. So let's get back to the question we are tasked with answering. Explain how the audience affects what Mikhail Gorbachev includes in his speech. Let's answer this question together. As always, we need to respond in complete sentences, and we need to make sure our answer contains two parts. Part 1 should clearly state the author's intended audience, and Part 2 should state how the audience affected what is included in the document, while citing specific examples. So let's begin by stating Mikhail Gorbachev's intended audience. Since Mikhail Gorbachev's speech was broadcast on Soviet television and printed in Soviet newspapers, his intended audience was likely all the citizens of the Soviet Union. Now, we have to address the second half of our answer, which explains how this audience affects the message of the author. Let's continue by restating some of the question. This audience affects what Mikhail Gorbachev included in his speech by, and here is where we want to paraphrase pieces of evidence from the document we discussed before that would have been appealing to this particular audience. Here's what I would put in my answer. This audience affects what Mikhail Gorbachev included in his speech by choosing to discuss the positive aspects of his presidency, such as bringing social, political, and economic reforms to the Soviet Union, like free elections, freedom of the press, and the formation of joint stock companies. You should be aware that it is absolutely possible to infer other ways in which this audience has affected Gorbachev's speech. I would recommend checking out this question on the January 2020 Regents exam and take a look at all the possible answers that the state accepted as being correct. The link to the exam is in the description below. In my experience, determining the impact of an audience on an author's messaging is one of the most difficult skills assessed on the Regents exam. I would recommend practicing these skills as often as possible. If you are studying on your own and you are encountering questions that refer to a document's purpose or point of view, you can ask yourself how the audience might be affecting the author's messaging. Come up with a couple of possible answers, and then maybe see your social studies teacher to review the accuracy of your responses. So that's going to do it for our discussion of audience, and how to apply your new knowledge to answering questions about audience on the Part 2 section of the Global History Regents exam. In the next video, we will begin to discuss the various ways in which the Regents will ask you to utilize pairs of documents in order to produce a written response. Thanks for watching, and keep on studying.